A small Vietnamese fishing boat putters along in the dark. A storm has knocked down its radio antenna, and the cheap GPS unit the poor fishermen used to navigate has long ago stopped functioning. They're sailing using the stars now, the way their ancient forefathers did, and cast a westerly course in hopes of hitting the mainland. Suddenly, a bright spotlight blasts the fishermen in the face, completely blinding them. A massive Chinese destroyer quickly steams in close to the small fishing vessel. In the dark, the fishermen hadn't even noticed it approaching. Two Zodiac craft full of Chinese Marines are tearing through the water at high speeds toward the fishermen, the machine guns at the bow of each boat aimed at them. With frenzied shouts, the Chinese Marines board the craft and push the fishermen to the floor, zip-tying their hands behind their back. They'll be arrested, interrogated, temporarily held, and eventually released back to their native Vietnam. Their ship will be pulled apart piece by piece in search of secret spy gear. The fishermen will never see it in one piece again. Their crime? Accidentally sailing too close to one of China's growing number of illegal military fortifications in the South China Sea. The controversy began back in 2014 as China began to implement a plan to aggressively expand its military power and national sovereignty into the South China Sea. With the world's largest fleet of dredging craft, China began to build up 7 isolated reefs in the South China Sea, hundreds of miles from mainland China. The massive ships sucked in sand from the bottom of the ocean and stored it in huge tanks, then released it onto the small beaches of these tiny reefs, gradually building up the reefs until it had turned into islands. The move was immediately met by international condemnation. Vietnam, the Philippines, and other neighbors have their own far more legitimate claims to the region, which China has largely ignored. Citing a map drawn by the Chinese national government in the 1940s and dubious claims about sea exploration during the Ming Dynasty, China maintains that a 9-dash line extending all the way to Malaysia in the south, the Philippines in the east, and running along Vietnam's coast is China's true national claim to the ocean. This 9-dash line encompasses nearly the entire South China Sea and ignores the economic exclusion zones of neighboring nations as set by international law. Along with its army of dredgers, China also developed a massive Coast Guard fleet dedicated to the intimidation and harassment of other nations' ships. Armed with water cannons, Chinese ships ran off Vietnamese, Malaysian, and Filipino fishing vessels, while escorting its own fishing fleets to some of the world's richest fishing grounds. In an extremely bold and controversial move, China even moved an oil drilling platform directly into Vietnamese waters and began extracting petroleum and natural gas from the site. China's strategy was twofold. First, it would build up artificial reefs throughout the Paracel and Spratly Islands, turning them into solid ground and moving Chinese military troops there. Under international law, a country can't claim waters around an island feature unless that island has a permanent presence of the nation's inhabitants. This is also the reason why, to counter Chinese claims, the Filipino Navy regularly maintains soldiers stationed on old shipwrecks around reefs in the Spratly Islands. These soldiers rely on resupply from Filipino Navy ships for everything from batteries to food and water. Yet almost immediately, the Chinese Navy began to blockade Filipino Navy ships from reaching those soldiers in an attempt to starve them out of their positions. China's second part to its strategy, to illegally claim the South China Sea, was to build up a large enough military presence that it simply wouldn't be possible to remove China from the area. This would be tricky, though, as it requires massive construction efforts over many years until the islands were big enough to hold large amounts of military equipment. Vietnam and its neighbors in the South China Sea are too weak militarily to do anything about China's expansion, so they filed a complaint with the UN. In 2016, a ruling from the International Court at The Hague found China's claims and island reclamation abilities to be illegal and ordered a halt to further expansion on the contested reefs. China immediately ignored that order, and the world did nothing to enforce it. The real question is, why is China burning global goodwill for the sake of a few island bases? The answer to that is threefold, and the first part of the answer is economic. The South China Sea holds 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil in reserves, with much more believed to lie undiscovered. The surplus of energy is worth trillions to the Chinese, and along with its oil and natural gas, the region is also home to some of the world's remaining fertile fishing grounds, worth billions in revenue. By edging out all other nations from their own legitimate claims to the region, China has positioned itself to amass a staggering wealth, paying out over decades to come. Secondly, China has long chafed at the United States' status as a regional security partner with its neighbors. One of China's greatest ambitions is to throw the US out of the South Pacific, and thus bully its neighbors into its own political sphere of influence, no different than the Soviet Union and its Iron Curtain post-World War II. Today, the South China Sea is the world's greatest trade artery, with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade moving through the region every year. The U.S. Navy guarantees freedom of navigation for all vessels in the region. Yet, if China could successfully push the U.S. out of the region, all of that trade from nations around the world would be subject to China's authority. Any nations China finds itself displeased with could soon find their merchant vessels harassed or even outright barred from traversing the region, a serious concern for any country that doesn't want to be subject to the Chinese Communist Party's will. The plan is working. As China continues to build military infrastructure across the reclaimed islands, it'll become increasingly unrealistic for the United States Navy to remain in the region and expect to survive in case of war. With U.S. forces effectively pushed out of the region, China's neighbors will have no choice but to deal with China. Something Vietnam is so afraid of, it recently held discussions with U.S. diplomats about potential cooperation with the U.S. military. The third answer to China's wish to establish itself in the South China Sea is to protect itself from the military power of the U.S. China understands that it cannot challenge the U.S. Navy in a stand-up fight, even with a portion of the U.S. naval forces stationed in the Atlantic. However, the buildup of military facilities around the South China Sea has officially put China in a position to not just challenge the U.S. Navy, but to prevent it from operating in the region outright in the case of war. China has built just under 100 bunkers for fighter aircraft across its 7 artificial islands and invested billions in anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile batteries, long-range radar, signals intelligence equipment, and even missile defense batteries. Sea-Whiz gun mounts protect Chinese radar and missile installations, and several of the runways China built are large enough to host Chinese bombers loaded with long-range anti-ship missiles. All of this firepower has effectively made it impossible for the U.S. to intervene in the region at the outset of war and push back U.S. forces to Guam if they hope to avoid immediate destruction. While eventually U.S. firepower could level all 7 of these island bases, the investment would be extremely costly in terms of missiles and hardware both. Each base would need approximately 100 missiles to completely neutralize, and a significant number of those missiles would be knocked out by Chinese missile defenses. High-altitude airstrikes would be a far better option, but even B-2 stealth bombers would find the environment challenging to operate in, and non-stealth aircraft would have practically zero survivability. What's more, all the firepower needed to neutralize these island bases and open up the South China Sea again is much more desperately needed further up north in defense of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. All of these which no doubt find themselves under threat from Chinese forces should a regional war break out. The only American hardware that could operate within the contested sea space would be American submarines. Chinese anti-submarine capabilities are still lacking. However, these subs would be focused on sinking Chinese ships and subs and wouldn't be risked to just undertake largely ineffective missile attacks against the island fortresses. China's successful strategy to claim the South China Sea has been an incremental war of inches, with President Xi Jinping correctly guessing that the United States would never risk a full-blown war as long as China's aggressive expansion was done very incrementally, just a few inches at a time. Now, in 2021, not only has China won the war of inches, but guaranteed that in a future US-Sino conflict, freeing the South China Sea once more will require incredible amounts of American blood and resources both, a price we may simply not be willing to pay. In the end, it's the rest of the world that ends up losing as China wins big. Now go watch US vs. China 2020 military comparison, or click this other video instead.